"You'll never steal again, you blind brat." The shout cut through the icy forest night, echoing among the trees as the father, his hands trembling with blind rage and deep despair, pushed his son into the gloom. The boy, blind and terrified by the impenetrable darkness and abandonment, stumbled, falling onto the damp earth, and his cry echoed, mingling with a distant growl that made the man's blood run cold. And then he saw the shining eyes in the darkness before the giant shadow advanced. The shadow that advanced was not the death the father, in his blind despair and bitterness, secretly hoped for, but something far more complex and heartbreaking. The boy, huddled on the cold, damp ground, felt the air vibrate with the massive presence. A strong, wild, earthy smell filled his nostrils, and he awaited the final blow, the end of his miserable existence. His small shoulders trembled uncontrollably, and a sob caught in his throat was the only sound he could emit. He squeezed his already useless eyes, as if the darkness could deepen even further to protect him from what was to come. But the blow never came. Instead, he felt a warm, damp snout gently brush his cheek. A low, deep growl reverberated in his chest, but it was not a threat. It seemed a murmur of comfort. A rough, warm tongue licked the dirt and tears from his face, then the small wound on his knee where he had fallen. The boy, confused, stopped crying. The fear persisted, but a strange sensation of warmth and protection began to infiltrate his small body. He extended a trembling hand and touched something soft and furry, a vastness of warm fur that pulsed with life, feeling the gentle rhythm of the creature's breathing. Hidden behind a dense bush, the father watched, paralyzed by terror and disbelief. His eyes, once filled with rage and despair, were now wide with horror and growing perplexity. He expected to see his son torn apart, a brutal image that, in his sick mind, would be the culmination of his own misery and guilt. But what he saw was unimaginable, something that defied all the logic and cruelty he knew. The enormous tigress, with her dark stripes and amber eyes glowing in the dim light, was not a predator, but a guardian. She nestled around the boy, enveloping him with her warm, powerful body as if he were her own cub, offering him an unexpected refuge. Other tigers from the pack, silent and imposing shadows, remained at a respectful distance, observing the scene with an almost reverent calm. The father's heart pounded erratically, a drum of shame and remorse echoing in his ears. The image of the tigress licking his son's wounds, offering him warmth and solace, pierced his soul like a poisoned arrow. He, the father, the human being who should protect, had abandoned his own flesh and blood to the mercy of the forest, while a wild beast showed a compassion he himself had denied. Tears, long dried by bitterness and wounded pride, began to stream down his face, hot and painful, washing away years of pain and guilt. He saw the unwavering purity of his son, the innocence he had tried to crush with his own pain and resentment. The boy, once a burden, was now a mirror reflecting the monstrosity of his actions, the cruelty of his hardened heart. Each lick from the tigress was a blow to his conscience. Each murmur from the beast, a silent cry of accusation that resonated within him. The father felt he was the true monster there, not the majestic creature of the jungle. The forest, which he so feared and hated, revealed a profound lesson of unconditional love and acceptance that he, in his emotional blindness, could never have foreseen. His knees gave way, and he fell to the cold ground, his hands clutching the earth, trying to contain the sobs that threatened to tear his chest. The promise of redemption, of a life of unconditional love and protection, began to form in his mind, a thin thread of hope amidst the darkness of his own heart. He needed to act. He needed to rescue his son, not from the forest, but from himself, from the prison of his own bitterness. The father, his body still bent by shock and his soul in tatters, felt the cold earth penetrate his bones, but it was the heat of shame that consumed him from within. The image of the tigress, a bastion of wild tenderness, contrasted brutally with his own cruelty, and every fiber of his being cried out for redemption. He rose with difficulty, his muscles stiff and sore, but the physical pain was minuscule compared to the agony of his conscience. His eyes, once blinded by bitterness, now saw clearly the monstrosity of his actions and the unwavering purity of his son. There was no more time for hesitation. The promise of a new life, of unconditional love, pulsated in his chest like an urgent call. Each step towards his son and the pack was a battle against the ancestral fear of the forest and his own guilt. The icy night air seemed to whisper accusations, and the shadows of the trees danced like ghosts of his mistakes. But the sight of the small body nestled in the tigress's protection was a beacon, guiding him through his own darkness. His lips trembled, and his hands, which had once pushed his son into the abyss, now extended in a gesture of supplication, of surrender. He was no longer the man hardened by pain, but a broken father, desperate to reclaim what he had almost lost. The tigers, once mere shadows, now seemed like silent observers, their amber eyes fixed on him with an intensity that pierced his soul. The tigress, enveloping the boy, majestically raised her head, a low guttural growl vibrating in her chest, a warning, but without the ferocity of an imminent attack. The father stopped a few steps away, slowly kneeling on the damp earth, his tear-filled eyes fixed on the beast. "Please," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I came for my son. I was wrong. I promise. I promise to love him and protect him." To his surprise, the tigress did not advance. Instead, she studied him with an almost human wisdom, her eyes seeming to probe the sincerity of his heart. Slowly, with a surprising grace for her size, she moved, stepping back a little from the boy, as if granting permission, an unexpected truce. The father did not hesitate. He crawled closer to his son, tears streaming freely down his face. The boy, still confused and enveloped in the residual warmth of the beast, extended a trembling little hand. "Father," the childish voice was a thin thread of uncertainty and hope. The father embraced him with a strength he never knew he possessed, pressing his son against his chest, feeling the small body tremble in his arms. "My son, my love," he sobbed, kissing the boy's soft hair. "Forgive me. Forgive me for everything. I was blind, much blinder than you, my little one. I swear by all that is sacred that you will never again feel cold, hunger, or fear. I will be your guide, your eyes, your safe harbor. I will be the father you deserve." The words, laden with deep remorse and an unwavering promise, echoed in the stillness of the forest. The tigers, still present, observed the scene with a calm that seemed to bless the moment of redemption. The father felt the warmth of his son's body against his own, a warmth that was not just physical, but the flame of a reborn love. The lesson of the forest, of wild compassion, had been brutal but transformative. He had found his son, not just physically, but in his own heart, and promised that from then on, every beat of his heart would be dedicated to healing the wounds he himself had caused, building a life of love, overcoming adversity, and unwavering human connection. The father, still kneeling on the cold earth, held his son close to his chest, feeling the warmth of the small body as a balm for his wounded soul. The words of forgiveness and promise had been spoken, but he knew that true redemption would begin now, with every breath, every gesture. Slowly, he raised his tear-filled eyes to the majestic tigress. She watched him with a serenity that seemed to transcend wild nature, a gaze that carried the wisdom of one who had witnessed the deepest transformation. With an almost imperceptible nod of her head, the beast turned, and the pack, like silent shadows, began to move away, disappearing into the darkness of the forest, leaving behind only the echo of their lesson. With his son in his arms, the father stood up, his legs still trembling, but his soul now carried a renewed purpose. The fear of the forest, once paralyzing, had given way to a silent reverence for the compassion he had found there. He held the boy a little tighter, smelling the earth and the tiger that still enveloped his son, a vivid reminder of the miracle he had just witnessed. "Let's go home, my little one," he whispered, his voice still choked, but now laden with a tenderness that had long been forgotten. The walk back to the village was unlike any other. The father held his son's hand firmly, but with a sweetness the boy had never experienced. Each stumble of the blind boy was supported with patience, each sigh heard with attention. The father, who once saw his son as a burden, now felt him as the most precious of loads. He described the path, the stars twinkling in the sky, the scent of night flowers, trying to paint a world for the eyes that could not see, a world he himself had refused to see for so long. The boy, confused but warmed by his father's presence, clung to that hand, an anchor amidst the storm of emotions. His heart, once so accustomed to loneliness and fear, began to feel a glimmer of hope, a timid flame that threatened to ignite. Upon reaching the small cabin, the misery of the place seemed even crueler under the moonlight, but the father no longer felt the bitterness of before. He lit the small oil lamp, and the flickering light revealed the dirt and disorder that had accumulated, a reflection of his own soul. Carefully, he sat his son on the straw bed, kneeling before him. He took out a piece of dry bread he had saved and offered it to the boy. "Eat, my son. You will never be hungry again." The boy took the bread with trembling hands, and the father watched, with a heavy heart, the voracity with which the boy devoured the food. That night, the father did not sleep. Sitting beside his son's bed, he watched the small, sleeping body, the scars of hunger and abandonment etched on his skin. The tears returned, but this time they were not of bitterness, but of an overwhelming love and a silent promise. He would spend the rest of his days healing the wounds he caused, rebuilding trust, teaching his son that the world, despite its cruelties, could also be a place of compassion and affection. The lesson of the forest, of wild kindness, had planted a seed of hope in his heart, and he swore he would water it with all the love he had denied. The path would be long and arduous, but for the first time in years, the father felt there was a future, a purpose, a chance at redemption. The first timid and pale sunbeams crept through the window cracks of the small cabin, finding the father still awake, sitting beside his son's bed. The night had been long, punctuated by sighs and the disturbing quietness of the sleeping boy. Each shadow that the morning light chased away seemed to carry with it a piece of the darkness that had inhabited the father's heart. He touched his son's forehead with his fingertips, feeling the gentle warmth of life, and a lump formed in his throat. It was no longer bitterness that choked him, but a torrent of love and remorse, a river he had dammed for years and that now overflowed. When the boy awoke, his lightless eyes moved restlessly, searching for something they could not see, but which his keen hearing already perceived: his father's presence. The father leaned in, his face marked by insomnia, but with a hesitant smile, a visible effort to soften the expression his son knew so well. "Good morning, my son," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. The boy trembled at the sound of the voice, and his body recoiled slightly, remembering the blind fury it once carried. Fear, a persistent shadow, still hung over him. The father noticed the retraction, and his heart tightened with a sharp pain. Trust, he knew, would not be regained in a single night, nor in a single plea for forgiveness. "Don't be afraid, my little one," the father murmured, extending his hand slowly, with a caution he had never shown. "I will never hurt you again, I promise." The boy hesitated, his body tense, Then, with a courage that surprised and moved the father, extended his own trembling little hand, feeling the rough, warm touch. That hand, which had once pushed him into darkness, now welcomed him with an unexpected tenderness. The father held it delicately, as if it were a fragile bird, fearing to break it. That simple gesture, a handshake, was the first brick in the bridge he needed to build between them, a bridge over the abyss of pain he himself had created. The days that followed were a slow and painful healing process for both. The father dedicated himself entirely to his son with a devotion that bordered on penance. He cooked the little food they had with a care he had never shown, ensuring the boy ate first, watching each mouthful with an almost desperate attention. He cleaned the small cabin with a diligence he once reserved only for himself, sweeping away the dirt and disorder, an external reflection of the order he was trying to re-establish in his soul. For the first time, he spoke with his son, not with reprimands or orders, but with stories about the village, about the sounds of nature that surrounded them, about the few moments of joy he himself had known before pain and bitterness consumed him. The boy, though still cautious, and with his senses on alert, began to respond. His smiles were rare and timid, but they were like sunbeams on a cloudy day for the father, illuminating the darkness of his guilt. He learned to guide himself by the sounds of his father's voice, by the softness of his touch, by the new cadence of his steps. Hunger, which was once a constant and terrifying presence, began to diminish, replaced by the security of knowing there would be food, that someone cared for him. But the emotional scars were deep. Sometimes the boy would flinch at his father's slightest sudden movement, or an unexpected sound would make him tremble. And the father felt the pang of guilt, remembering every cruel word, every abandonment. One afternoon, as the father was mending an old wooden toy he had found for his son, the boy asked, his voice low, almost inaudible, "Father, the tigers, were they good?" The father stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt beside his son, taking his small hands and squeezing them gently. "Yes, my son, they were very good. They protected you when I couldn't." The words came out with difficulty, laden with a painful truth and a newfound humility. "They showed me what love is, what compassion is, and they taught me to be a better father." The boy tilted his head, thoughtful, and a small smile appeared on his lips. "They licked me," he said with a hint of admiration in his voice, "and they were warm." The father smiled too, a solitary tear rolling down his already marked face. The memory of the forest, once a nightmare that haunted him, was now an unexpected bond between them, a testament to redemption. He knew the journey would be long, that trust would take time to fully blossom, but in that moment, in that small smile, he saw the promise of a future where love, overcoming adversity, and unwavering human connection would be the rocks upon which they would rebuild their lives. He promised himself that he would never again fail his son, that he would be worthy of the lesson the forest and its majestic guardians had given him. The promise made in the quietness of the cabin, under the silent gaze of dawn, was not just an oath to his son, but a pact with himself, the rebirth of the soul. He knew that words were only the beginning. Redemption would require acts, sacrifices, and patience he had never known he possessed. That day, the village noticed a subtle but profound change. The father, once a specter of bitterness who dragged himself through the dusty streets, now walked with purpose, holding his blind son's hand with protective firmness. The curious and suspicious glances of the neighbors were like needles on his skin, but he endured them, for he knew he deserved every look. The first task was the hardest, finding work. The father's reputation, stained by neglect and cruelty, preceded him. Doors closed, faces hardened, and the whispers of the man who abandoned his son haunted him. But he did not give up. With his son by his side, he knocked on door after door, offering himself for any task, no matter how humble. He carried stones, cleaned stables, mended fences, all for a handful of coins that would ensure bread and perhaps meat for the boy. Every drop of sweat, every aching muscle was penance, an offering of love. The boy felt the change. His father's touch, once abrupt and impatient, was now gentle and constant. The voice, which once brought fear, narrated simple stories of the day, of the sounds of the wind in the trees, of the smell of wet earth after the rain. He learned to identify his father's footsteps, the rhythm of his breathing, and slowly, the tension in his shoulders lessened. One afternoon, while the father worked in a neighbor's garden, the boy, sitting beside him, reached out and touched his father's sweaty face. It was a small, hesitant gesture, but laden with incipient trust. The father stopped working, his eyes tear-filled, and pressed his son's small hand against his cheek, feeling the warmth and the promise of a future. The community, little by little, began to witness the transformation. Distrust did not completely disappear, but some hearts softened. An old weaver, known for her kindness, offered wool for the boy, and the father, his voice choked, thanked her. Another neighbor, a carpenter, offered him more regular work, seeing the dedication in the man's eyes. It was not complete forgiveness, but a recognition that the change was real, that the father was fighting to be worthy of his son. At night, in the now cleaner and more organized cabin, the father read to his son, using an old, dusty book he had found. The words were difficult, but the melody of his voice was a balm for the boy. He described the images, the colors the son could not see, building a universe of imagination. The boy, nestled in a blanket the weaver had donated, listened attentively, and for the first time in a long time, slept without nightmares, lulled by his father's voice and the new security that enveloped him. The path was long, but every step, gesture, and word was a brick in the reconstruction of a love that seemed lost, a testament to the unwavering human capacity for overcoming adversity and redemption. The father's days unfolded in a rhythm of tireless work and silent devotion. Each morning, he woke before the sun, preparing a simple breakfast, ensuring his son had the first bite. His hands, once accustomed only to the roughness of the earth and impatience, now moved with surprising delicacy as he combed the boy's hair, as he helped him dress in his few clothes. The village, which once viewed him with contempt, now observed him with a mixture of curiosity and cautious admiration for his persistence. The whispers had not completely ceased, but the tone had changed. He accepted any work, no matter how heavy or humble, and the boy accompanied him, sitting patiently in the shade of a tree or near the fire, listening to the sounds of the world that his father described with a richness of detail that was once foreign to him. The boy's trust, like a delicate flower, began to blossom. He no longer flinched as much at his father's touch, and his small fingers sought the rough, protective hand more frequently. One afternoon, while the father worked at the blacksmith's forge, the boy, drawn by the heat and the rhythmic sound of the hammer, reached out to feel the heat of the incandescent metal. The father, with a quick reflex, diverted his hand, explaining the danger with a patience that would have been unthinkable months ago. The boy, instead of crying or recoiling, merely nodded, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was a sign, a bond of connection that the father held in his heart as the most precious of treasures. Life in the cabin, though still modest, had acquired a new order. The father spent his nights mending clothes, repairing the few utensils, and most importantly, reading to his son. The stories, taken from a worn-out book he had traded for hours of work, spoke of distant worlds, of bravery and kindness. The boy listened, absorbed, and the questions he asked revealed a curious mind and a spirit that, despite everything, remained intact. The father, in answering, felt each word as a balm for the wounds he himself had inflicted, another brick in the bridge he was building between them. However, the calm was fragile, and the forest, though now viewed with a different reverence by the father, was still a source of fear for the village. Rumors about the tiger pack previously contained began to resurface with renewed intensity. One night, during a meeting in the central square where the elders discussed the future of the harvest and the community's safety, the voice of the elder, a man respected for his wisdom, echoed with concern. "The beasts of the forest are bolder," he said, his eyes fixed on the darkness that enveloped the trees. "Cattle have gone missing, and there are tracks too large near the trails. We need to act before it's too late." A shiver ran down the father's spine. He knew the elder was speaking of the tigers, the same animals that had protected his son. The other men agreed, their voices laden with fear and anger. "We need to hunt them," one of them shouted. "Clear the forest once and for all." The father felt his blood run cold. Hunt the tigers, his son's guardians? The idea was a blow to the heart, an affront to the lesson learned. He squeezed his son's hand, who was by his side, feeling the tremor of the small body. He could not allow it. He could not betray the wild compassion that had redeemed him. His heart pounded, a drum of conflict. He, who had been the monster, now felt compelled to protect the true heroes. It was an unexpected turning point, a test of his redemption. He needed to speak. He needed to defend those who had shown him love. He stood up slowly, his voice choked with emotion, but with a new strength he never knew he possessed. "We cannot hunt them," he said, and all heads turned to him, eyes filled with surprise and distrust. They are not the enemy." The village fell silent, the air tense, as the father prepared to face not only the fear of others but also his own past, defending the truth the forest had revealed to him. The silence broken by his voice was so heavy it seemed to crush the air. The men's faces, previously agitated, were now petrified, turned towards him with a mixture of incredulity and contempt. The elder, with his deep wrinkles and wise eyes, stared at him with an intensity that made him tremble inside. The father squeezed his son's hand, seeking strength in the small body beside him. He felt the boy's tremor, the confusion that the tension of the environment generated. It was for him, for his son, that he needed to speak, so that the truth finally would set everyone free. "I know what you think," he began, his voice still hoarse, but gaining firmness with each word. "You think I've gone mad, that I'm defending the beasts that threaten us, but you don't know the truth. I hid it out of shame, out of guilt, but I can't anymore." He paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of every judging gaze. I abandoned my son in the forest. Yes, I did that. I left him there alone, blind in the darkness, so he would learn a cruel lesson. I was a bitter man, blinded by pain and guilt over my wife's death, and I blamed him for everything. A murmur of shock ran through the crowd. Some women put their hands to their mouths, their eyes wide with horror. Men exchanged censorious glances, and some turned their faces away, unable to confront such a brutal confession. The father felt shame burn on his face, but continued, driven by an urgent need for redemption and the memory of wild compassion. "I left him to die, or to be devoured. I was a monster," he confessed, his voice choked with tears that now flowed freely, wetting his beard. "But the beasts you want to hunt, they did not devour him. They protected him. A tigress, yes, a wild tigress, nestled my son, warmed him, protected him from the icy night. She licked him as if he were her own cub, healing the wounds that I, his own father, had caused." The silence that followed was even deeper, a silence of astonishment. The story was so unbelievable, so contrary to everything they knew about the forest and its dangers. The elder, however, did not look away. His eyes seemed to penetrate the father's soul, seeking the truth behind the words, the sincerity in his despair. "I saw it," the father continued, his voice now a thread of pure emotion, almost a lament. "I was hidden, paralyzed by fear and remorse. I saw the wild compassion, the purity of an animal that was more human than I. It was there that night that I realized the monstrosity of my actions. It was the tigress who taught me what love is, what it is to be a father." He knelt right there, on the beaten earth of the square, holding his son in his arms, as if the small body were the living proof of his words. I begged my son for forgiveness and promised him a life of unconditional love. And I promise you, all of you, that these animals are not the enemy. They are guardians. They gave us a lesson, a chance to see the world with different eyes. If we hunt them, we will be denying ourselves the chance to understand something greater, something that transcends our fear and our ignorance. A man, his face hardened by life in the fields, stepped forward, his voice laden with skepticism and anger. "You expect us to believe this story? That tigers, wild predators, would protect a child? It's madness." Others nodded, fear still dominating reason, their fists clenched. The father raised his head, his eyes red from crying, but with an unwavering determination. "I don't ask you to believe me blindly. I ask you to think, to remember what I was, and to see who I am now. I have changed, and that change came from the forest, from the lesson the tigers gave me. They are not a threat if we respect them. They are part of this place, and perhaps, just perhaps, they have something to teach us about the true nature of compassion." The elder, who had remained silent, finally spoke, his voice calm but authoritative. "The father's story is hard to swallow, I know, but the change in his heart, that is undeniable. See how he cares for his son now. The forest has always had its mysteries. Perhaps it is time for us to listen to what it has to tell us before we act with the blind fury of fear." His words, though not resolving everything, planted a seed of doubt and reflection in the hearts of the villagers, opening a small crack for hope and understanding. The father, with his son nestled in his arms, felt a glimpse of relief, knowing that the battle for truth was just beginning. The seed of doubt planted by the elder was fragile, almost imperceptible in the hardened soil of fear. The villagers slowly dispersed, their voices low and full of uncertainty, some still casting suspicious glances at the father. He felt the weight of each judgment, but the small hand of his son on his chest was a constant reminder of his new truth. That night, the cabin seemed a refuge, but the silence was filled with the echoes of unspoken words, of silent accusations. The boy, sensitive to the atmosphere, nestled closer to his father, seeking comfort in the warmth of his body. The father hugged him tightly, promising himself that he would not fail again, neither his son nor the guardians of the forest. The days that followed were a test of his newfound resilience. Most villagers avoided him, and the work that once came with difficulty was now almost non-existent. Whispers turned into direct looks of disapproval. "Madman, liar, ally of the beasts." The words were not spoken aloud, but he felt them like stones thrown at his soul. Even so, he did not bow. With his son by his side, he continued to knock on doors, offering his services, not out of desperation, but out of an unwavering conviction. He needed to show through his actions that the change was real, that the lesson of the forest had been profound. One morning, as he tried to convince a farmer to let him mend a fence, the man spat on the ground. "You want me to trust a man who defends tigers? Tigers that can devour my cattle or worse, my children? Get out and take your madness with you." The father felt anger bubble up, but he took a deep breath, remembering the tigress's calm. "I understand your fear," he said, his voice controlled. But fear blinds us. I know what it is to be blind with fear. I was, and I almost lost everything. Tigers are not a threat if we respect them. I can show you." The farmer scoffed and slammed the door in his face. The frustration was a heavy burden, but the father could not afford to give in to it. He knew he needed to do more than just talk. He needed to act. That afternoon, instead of looking for work, he took his son to the edge of the forest, not to abandon him, but to observe it, to understand its rhythms, to try to find a way to prove his words. He described the sounds to the boy, the rustling of leaves, the singing of birds, the distant murmur of the stream. "Listen, my son," he said, his voice soft. "The forest speaks, and it teaches us." He began to spend hours on the periphery of the forest, mapping trails, observing tracks, trying to identify animal behavior patterns. He did not want to hunt the tigers, but to coexist. He wanted to understand the forest, to protect both the village and the animals. The villagers who saw him shook their heads, convinced of his insanity. But the father persisted, his determination a shield against contempt. He found tracks of deer, of wild boars, but the tiger tracks were rarer, always distant from cultivated areas, as if the majestic felines had an innate respect for invisible boundaries. One afternoon, returning from the forest, the father saw a group of children throwing stones at a stray dog. The boy, clinging to his hand, trembled at the animal's cries of pain. The father, without hesitation, ran to the children, his voice firm but without anger. "Stop that! There's no honor in hurting the weaker ones." The surprised children dropped their stones and fled. The father knelt, stroking the frightened dog, offering it a piece of bread he had in his pocket. The boy, sensing the scene, reached out and touched the dog's head, a gesture of pure compassion. That small act, witnessed by some curious neighbors, began to sow a new perception. It was not about the tigers, but about the kindness the father now radiated, the gentleness he showed towards the vulnerable. The battle for truth was a battle for his own soul, and he was determined to win it, one act of love and compassion at a time. He knew that redemption was not a destination, but a continuous journey, paved with the humility and persistence of a heart that had finally found its purpose. The father's journey towards redemption was arduous, but guided by a clarity he previously lacked. He did not seek the immediate forgiveness of the villagers, but understanding, the recognition of his transformation. Each dawn found him at the edge of the forest, the boy by his side, his small fingers clutching his father's hand. He continued to observe, but to learn. He described the sounds of the forest to his son, the rustling of leaves, the singing of birds, the buzzing of bees among the wildflowers. He spoke of the colors he imagined, the textures of the trees, the smell of damp earth, and the freshness of the dew. The boy, with his keen mind, absorbed every detail, building a vivid world in his darkness, a world his father now revealed to him with love and dedication. Days turned into weeks. The father, with his newfound patience, began to notice patterns. The tiger tracks, though large and imposing, rarely approached cultivated areas or well-used trails. There seemed to be an invisible boundary that the felines respected, a kind of silent pact with human territory, as long as they were not provoked. He realized that the cattle disappearances, which frightened the village, occurred when the animals ventured too deep into the forest in search of richer pastures. It was not indiscriminate predatory hunting, but a response to the invasion of their own domain, a lesson of boundaries and respect. The villagers' distrust persisted. The farmer who had chased him away spread rumors, and the father felt the weight of isolation, a constant and painful shadow. But the small seed planted by the elder and the act of kindness towards the stray dog had not been in vain. One afternoon, as the father and son returned from the forest, an elderly woman, Mrs. Ilara, who had witnessed the incident with the dog, called out to him. Her eyes, once full of caution, now carried a glimmer of curiosity and a hint of sympathy. "My well has dried up, Father," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't have the strength to go to the river." The father, without hesitation, nodded. "I'll help you, Mrs. Ilara." He left his son in the shade of a large tree and with a bucket in his hands walked to the river. The task was arduous, but he completed it with dedication, filling the old woman's well several times until it was full. Mrs. Ilara watched, her lips pressed together, but a warmth spread in her chest. "Thank you, Father," she said, offering him a piece of fresh bread and a glass of water. It was a small gesture, but for the father it meant the world, the first sign that the ice barrier was beginning to melt. The boy, who had waited patiently, felt the change in the atmosphere. Mrs. Ilara's voice was soft, and the smell of the bread was comforting. He squeezed his father's hand, a genuine smile illuminating his face. The father smiled back, feeling hope blossom. He knew that every act of kindness, every gesture of altruism was a step in the right direction, a silent proof of his transformation. That night, as the father told his son about the day, describing Mrs. Ilara's kindness, he felt a peace he had not known for a long time. He spoke about the importance of helping others, of reaching out even when the world seemed to turn its back. The boy listened, absorbed, and the image of his father, once a spectre of fear, was now that of a guardian, a teacher, a safe harbor. The following days brought more small gestures. Other villagers, seeing his dedication and willingness to help, began to seek him out for tasks. It was not complete forgiveness, but a recognition of his usefulness. He mended roofs, helped with the harvest, always with his son nearby, always with the same humility and persistence. He no longer spoke about the tigers. He did not try to convince with words. He simply acted, allowing his actions to speak for themselves, a living testament to his redemption. One morning, the father noticed that the tracks of a wild boar were dangerously close to the community garden. He knew that if the boar invaded, it would cause havoc, and the village would blame the beasts, rekindling the desire to hunt. With his son by his side, he followed the tracks, not to hunt, but to divert the animal. He used his knowledge of forest habits, creating a path of stones and branches that subtly directed the boar away from the crops to a denser area, rich in natural food. He worked in silence, with a clear purpose, unseen by anyone, with only the forest as his witness. The next day, the villagers noticed that the boar had not attacked the garden. There were murmurs of relief, and some wondered how the forest seemed calmer. The father, with a small smile, simply continued his work, knowing that true change began with small acts, with patience and respect for life in all its forms. He was building a bridge, not just between himself and his son, but between the village and the forest, a bond of understanding that wild compassion had initiated. Redemption, he realized, was an echo that reverberated through every gesture of love. He continued his journey, paving the way with the humility and persistence of a heart that had finally found its purpose. The small acts of kindness, once isolated, began to weave a thin web of trust in the village. Mrs. Ilara, whom he had helped with the well, now greeted him with a warm smile, and other neighbors, once skeptical, nodded in recognition. The boy, always by his side, was the living proof of his transformation, a beacon of purity that radiated a soft light over the darkness of the past. His son's small hands, which once recoiled, now sought his with confidence, a touch worth more than 1,000 words. Together, father and son spent their mornings at the edge of the forest, no longer with the fear that once separated them, but with a silent reverence. The father described to the boy the details his eyes captured, the sunlight filtering through the treetops, the vibrant colors of the flowers blooming after the rain, the graceful flight of a bird landing on a nearby branch. The boy, with his keen imagination, transformed these descriptions into a world of his own, rich in sensations and sounds. He felt the smell of damp earth, the freshness of the wind that carried the scent of leaves, and heard the whisper of the forest, which for him was no longer a place of danger but of mystery and life. The father, seeing him so absorbed, felt his heart overflow with a love he thought he had lost forever. Gradually, the village began to feel the effects of the father's new approach. He continued to divert wild boars from the gardens with his knowledge of the forest, and the small thefts of cattle decreased as he had warned the farmers about the most dangerous areas of the woods where wild animals fed. There was no longer the blind fury against the tigers, but a caution, a respect that began to emerge. The nightly meetings in the square, once dominated by fear and anger, now included discussions on how to coexist, how to protect the crops without harming the forest. The elder, with his wisdom, observed the father with a look of approval, recognizing the seed of truth he had planted. However, the peace was fragile. An unexpected drought began to plague the region, drying up streams and dwindling the pastures. The scarcity of water and food in the forest forced the animals to venture closer to the village in search of sustenance. One night, the father was awakened by desperate screams. A deer, hungry and thirsty, had invaded a plantation, causing considerable damage. The villagers, their fear rekindled by the loss and the proximity of the forest, began to stir again. "It's a sign!" someone shouted. "The beasts are coming! We need to act!" The father felt a tightening in his chest. He knew that the forest was suffering and that the animals, driven by necessity, were not an intentional threat, but victims of the same adversity. But how to explain this to the villagers, whose fear was palpable and understandable? He saw the hardened faces, the eyes full of panic, and knew that the fragile bridge of trust he had built could collapse at any moment. He hugged his son, who slept peacefully beside him, oblivious to the new tension that hung in the air. The promise he had made to that small being and to the wild guardians of the forest echoed in his heart. He could not allow fear to win again. The next morning the square was full. The farmer who had once chased him away now led the crowd, demanding a hunt. "We cannot wait for the forest to devour us," he shouted, his fists clenched. The elder tried to calm tempers, but the voice of fear was louder. The father knew this was the moment to act, to prove that coexistence was possible, even in the face of adversity. He stepped forward, his voice firm, but laden with an urgency that came from the depths of his soul. "Wait," he said, and all eyes turned to him, some with anger, others with a hint of hope. "I have an idea. A way to help the forest and protect the village without shedding blood, but I need your help. I need your trust." He extended his hand, a gesture of appeal and determination, ready to face the greatest challenge of his redemption, a challenge that would require not only his courage, but the unity of the entire village. The square fell silent, eyes fixed on the father. The farmer, his face hardened by anger, was the first to break the silence. "What's this idea, father? You want us to build a watering hole for the beasts that steal from us? It's madness." The father took a deep breath, seeking the calm the forest had taught him. "It's not madness, it's a solution. The drought affects us all. If the forest has no water, the animals will come to us out of necessity, not malice. My idea is to create a watering and feeding station at the edge of the forest, away from the crops, a safe place for them and for us." He gestured. "We will dig a deeper well, divert some of the stream water there, and leave fruits and vegetables we don't use. That way, they will have what they need without invading our lands." The elder nodded slowly. "It makes sense. The father has been observing the animals. He understands their ways." Mrs. Ilara, with her soft voice, added, "He helped me with my well, perhaps he is right. There was still hesitation, but the father's logic, supported by the elder and Mrs. Ilara, began to make fissures in the skepticism. The farmer, reluctant, had no better alternative. "What if it doesn't work?" he growled. "Then we will have tried," the father replied firmly. "But I believe it will work. They don't want conflict, just to survive. If we give them an option, they will take it." With a collective sigh, the villagers agreed to try. It was a fragile truce built on hope and desperation. The next day, the village mobilized. Men and women, some reluctantly, others with curiosity, followed the father to the edge of the forest. The boy, his small hand in his father's, was there, a silent symbol of faith. The father indicated the ideal spot, a small, hidden valley with access to a part of the stream. The task was arduous, digging the well under the scorching sun, carrying stones, diverting the water. Sweat poured, fatigue weighed heavily. The farmer complained with every shovel stroke, "This is wasted effort, they'll never come." The father, undeterred, continued to work, encouraging everyone by his example. The boy, sitting in the shade, listened to the sounds of work, the murmur of water beginning to flow, feeling the energy of collaboration. He knew his father was doing something important. By the end of the day, the well was ready, a basin of fresh water at the edge of the forest. The villagers spread fruits and vegetables. Silence fell over the group, a mixture of exhaustion and expectation. "Now we wait," the father said. "They will smell the water, the food. We will have to be patient." The first night was tense. The father, with his son asleep, sat at the door, his eyes fixed on the darkness. He knew everything depended on that act of faith. At dawn, a group of villagers ran to the new watering station. The father followed them, his heart pounding. The tracks were there, deer, wild boars, and yes, the imposing marks of a tiger. The water had been drunk, the fruits eaten. There were no signs of destruction, just evidence that the animals had found what they needed. A murmur of astonishment and relief ran through the group. The farmer, his eyes wide, looked at the father. They came, and they didn't cause any problems. The father smiled, a smile of hope and gratitude. They just wanted to survive, like us. That small success, the tangible proof of his theory, began to disarm the most hardened hearts. The bridge he had built seemed more solid. Coexistence, he realized, was not a utopia, but a real possibility, born of understanding and mutual respect. The climax was approaching, and the village was on the verge of a profound transformation, guided by the unexpected lesson of a father and the wild guardians of the forest. The small victory at the forest's edge reverberated far beyond the footprints in the mud. With each dawn, the villagers rushed to check the watering and feeding station, and each time they found silent proof that coexistence was possible. Deer, wild boars, and yes, the majestic tigers came and went, quenching their thirst and hunger without ever approaching the houses or the crops. Fear, which was once a dense and paralyzing fog, began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious curiosity and finally by a reluctant respect that took root in their hearts. The farmer, once the most skeptical and vocal in his anger, was the first to surrender completely. One morning, he found the father and the boy at the forest's edge, observing the fresh tracks of a tiger. Instead of fury, there was genuine admiration in his eyes. "Father," he said, his voice softer than ever, laden with an unexpected humility. "You were right. We were blind with fear and ignorance. You showed us the way to see beyond our own prejudices." He extended his hand, a gesture of forgiveness and acceptance that the father received with a lump in his throat and tear-filled eyes. It was the redemption he so sought, not in empty words, but in a sincere handshake that sealed a new beginning. From that day on, the transformation of the village was remarkable and profound. The nightly meetings in the square were no longer about hunting or revenge, but about how to improve the watering and feeding station, how to protect crops without harming the forest. The father, once marginalized and avoided, became the respected counselor, the vital link between the human and wild worlds. His understanding of the forest, once seen as dangerous madness, was now a treasure of wisdom. He taught the villagers to read the signs of nature, to respect invisible boundaries, to coexist in harmony. The boy, always by his father's side, was the pulsating heart of this new era. His presence, his unwavering innocence, reminded everyone of the purity the father had rediscovered and the human spirit's capacity to overcome adversity. He continued to see the world through his father's eyes, but now that world was a place of harmony, where the whispers of the forest were not a threat, but songs of life, rich in detail and sensations. The father described the vibrant colors of the flowers, the melodic singing of the birds, the golden glow of the sun on the stream's water, and the boy smiled, a smile that illuminated the darkness of his eyes, filling him with a joy and peace that once seemed unattainable. The guilt that gnawed at the father's heart finally dissolved, like the morning mist under the sun. He forgave himself, not only because the villagers forgave him, but because he had become the man his wife would have wanted him to be, a guardian of life, a loving father, a link of compassion. The forest, which one day was the stage of his cruelty and his redemption, was now a sanctuary of peace, a constant reminder of the lesson that the tigers, in their wild and unexpected wisdom, had taught him about unconditional love. The village prospered not just in harvests, but in spirit. The drought subsided, but the watering and feeding station remained, a lasting symbol of new understanding and altruism. Children grew up hearing stories, not of bloodthirsty beasts, but of majestic animals that shared the land, teaching them respect for life in all its forms. The father and son, inseparable, walked along the forest's edge, their hands clasped, their hearts in tune. Life, once marked by misery and loss, was now a hymn of hope, unconditional love, and a human and natural connection that blossomed from the most unexpected of lessons. Justice had been served, not by punishment, but by transformation, and overcoming adversity was the melody that cradled each new day, a testament to the resilience and goodness that reside in the human heart. Years passed, and the promise of a new beginning wove a tapestry of hope over the village. Misery, which was once a constant shadow, receded, replaced by a modest but dignified prosperity, the fruit of joint effort and new understanding. The watering and feeding station at the forest's edge was no longer just an emergency measure, but a sanctuary of coexistence, a place where wild and human life met in a silent pact of mutual respect. The villagers, guided by the father's persistence and tireless love, learned to read the signs of the forest, to understand that every creature had its place and importance in nature's delicate balance. The father, whose name the villagers now pronounced with a mixture of reverence and affection, was no longer the bitter widower, but a pillar of the community. His eyes, once clouded by guilt and pain, shone with a deep serenity, a reflection of the peace he had finally found in his heart. He continued to be the guardian of that invisible boundary, a mentor who taught new generations the importance of protecting the forest, not out of ancestral fear, but out of a genuine love for all forms of life that inhabited it. The village children, who once heard stories of dangerous beasts, now grew up with tales of majestic tigers that protected the woods, and of a man who, through unconditional love and humility, had healed a deep wound between two worlds. The boy who was once blind now saw the world with a clarity that surpassed sight. He became the eye of the forest for the village, an interpreter of its whispers and secrets. Sitting under the shade of an ancient tree, he taught the children to recognize the song of each bird, the scent of each flower, the texture of each leaf. His descriptions were so vivid that the little ones swore they could see the colors through his words and feel the wind he described as an invisible embrace. He told them about the tigress who had nestled him not with terror but with deep gratitude, instilling in them an unwavering respect for all creatures. The father watched his son, his heart overflowing with a love that time and trials had only strengthened. The guilt had completely disappeared, replaced by a peace that radiated from his being. He had kept his promise, not only to love and protect his son, but to transform himself and, by extension, his community. Justice, he had come to understand, was not an act of retribution, but a continuous process of healing and growth. Overcoming adversity was not a single event, but a daily journey of altruistic choices and connection. The village prospered in every sense. Harvests were abundant, water flowed, and the spirit of collaboration was palpable. Discussions in the square were no longer about fears, but about how to innovate, how to help neighbors, how to protect the delicate balance they had achieved. The figure of the elder, who had once observed the father with approval, had been replaced by a new generation of leaders, who carried with them the wisdom of coexistence, passed from mouth to mouth, from heart to heart. One afternoon, as the sun painted the sky with shades of orange and purple, the father and son sat together on the porch of their humble home, their hands clasped. The son described the crackling of the distant campfire, the smell of fresh bread coming from the neighbor's kitchen, the gentle sound of the wind in the trees, and the feeling of the setting sun's warmth on their faces. The father merely smiled, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the forest line met the sky, a scene of lasting peace. Life had given him a second chance, and he had embraced it with every fiber of his being. Human connection, he knew, was the true wealth and compassion, the greatest of inheritances. Their story was not just that of a redeemed man, but of a village reborn, an eternal testament to the transformative power of love.